The space station called Meridian 7 floated in the endless darkness between three great galaxies, and it served as neutral ground where no species held power over another, and where young beings from 1,000 different worlds came to learn together at the Galactic Unity Academy. Maya Chun sat in the back row of her advanced tactical theory class, and she tried very hard to look like she understood what Professor Kethrix was teaching. But the truth was that she felt completely lost among her alien classmates. The professor had 4 arms and skin that shimmered like oil on water, and he moved across the front of the room while pointing at holographic displays that showed battle formations and strategic principles that the other students seemed to grasp instantly. To her left sat a Kroth named Ven, and his body was covered in thick armor plates that could stop a laser blast, and his 3 eyes tracked the lesson with perfect focus. And Maya knew he could crush steel with his bare hands if he wanted to. To her right sat 3 Sundari students who could see electromagnetic fields and communicate through pulses of light that their skin produced. And they were having an entire conversation right now that Maya could not even detect, let alone understand. In front of her, a group of Vellani students sat with their large dark eyes half closed, and Maya knew they were sharing thoughts telepathically, probably discussing the lesson in ways that went far beyond what the professor was actually saying out loud. And then there was Maya, who was just human, which meant she had no armor and no telepathy and no special senses. And her muscles were weak compared to most species, and her bones were fragile. And she would live maybe 100 years while some of her classmates would see 1,000. She was 12 years old, and she came from a small city called Portland on a planet called Earth. And she had been chosen for this academy because her test scores were high by human standards. But here among the stars, she felt like nothing special at all. The only friend she had made was a Vellani girl named Sora, who sat 3 rows ahead and sometimes turned back to give Maya an encouraging smile. Sora had told her once that she liked being around Maya because human minds were quiet, and most species broadcasted their thoughts constantly like radio stations that never turned off. But humans were different somehow, and Sora found the silence peaceful. Maya appreciated the friendship, even if she did not fully understand it. And she tried her best to keep up with her studies and not embarrass her species. Too much. Professor Kethrix was explaining something about defensive positioning when his voice suddenly stopped, and all 4 of his arms froze in mid-gesture, and his translator device made a strange clicking sound. Then the alarms began. The sound was loud and sharp, and it cut through the air like a knife. And red lights began flashing along the ceiling, and every student in the room looked up with sudden fear in their eyes. "What is happening?" asked Ven the Kroth, and his deep voice rumbled through the room as he rose from his seat, and his armored plates shifted into a defensive configuration. Professor Kethrix held up one of his 4 hands for silence, and he pressed the other 3 against his translator as a message came through. And Maya watched his oil-slick skin turn pale in a way that told her something was very wrong. "The station has been boarded," the professor announced, and his voice was steady, but Maya could see his hands trembling. "The Vex Collective has breached the outer hull, and they are moving through the station taking hostages." The classroom erupted into chaos as students shouted and screamed and tried to run for the doors. But before anyone could reach them, the blast doors slammed shut with a heavy metallic sound that echoed through the room like a death sentence. Maya felt her heart pounding in her chest as she looked around at her panicking classmates. And she saw that even the mighty Kroth students looked afraid. And even the telepathic Vellani were too scared to think straight. She had heard of the Vex Collective before, and everyone in the galaxy had heard of them. And the stories were terrible. They were insectoid beings with hard shells and compound eyes and mandibles that could cut through bone. And they traveled from system to system taking prisoners. And those prisoners were never seen again. And it was said that the Vex harvested something from their captives, something in their minds, something that made them valuable as slaves or worse. Everyone stay calm, Professor Kethrix commanded, but his voice cracked on the last word. The station security forces will handle this situation, and we just need to wait here safely until they arrive. But Maya could see through the small window in the blast door, and she could see shadows moving in the corridor outside. And the shadows were wrong somehow, too angular and too fast. And they were coming closer. Sora found Maya in the crowd and grabbed her hand, and Maya could feel her friend shaking. And through their touch, she almost thought she could sense a whisper of Sora's fear bleeding through into her own mind. "Maya, I am scared," Sora whispered, and her large dark eyes were wet with tears. "I cannot sense their minds at all, and it is like they are not even alive out there." Maya squeezed her friend's hand and tried to think of something comforting to say. But before she could speak, there was a new sound from outside the door. It was the sound of metal being cut. And it was the sound of something burning through the blast door that was supposed to keep them safe. And it was the sound of the Vex coming for them. The students backed away from the door as a circle of glowing orange appeared in the metal. And the circle grew larger and larger as the thermal cutters did their work. And the heat filled the room, and the fear grew stronger with every passing second. Maya watched the door, and she felt something strange happening inside her chest. Something that was not quite fear and not quite courage, but something in between. Something that made her eyes sharp and her mind clear, even as everyone around her fell apart. She did not know yet that this was something humans had carried inside them for 100,000 years. This ability to stay calm when everything was falling apart. This ancient gift from ancestors who had survived ice ages and predators and wars and plagues. She only knew that she was watching and waiting and thinking. And that somewhere in the back of her mind, a plan was beginning to form. The circle of molten metal finally completed itself, and the cut section of the blast door fell inward with a crash that shook the floor. And through the smoking hole came the Vex soldiers, one after another like nightmares, stepping out of the darkness. Maya counted 6 of them as they entered. And each one stood nearly 7 feet tall with bodies covered in dark chitinous armor that looked like it could stop anything. And their heads were dominated by huge compound eyes that reflected the classroom lights in 1,000 tiny fragments. And their mandibles clicked together as they scanned. The room full of terrified students, the leader was easy to identify because his armor was scarred with old battle damage, and because the other soldiers moved aside to let him pass, and his mandibles were chipped and worn from years of violence. And when he spoke, his voice came through a translator that made it sound cold and mechanical. "You are now property of the Vex Collective," the commander announced. And his compound eyes swept across the room without emotion. "You will be processed, and you will serve, and you will not resist." Ven the Croth was the first to act. And Maya watched as he let out a roar that shook the walls and charged directly at the nearest Vex soldier with his armored fists raised for a killing blow. The Vex soldier did not even move, and he simply raised a small device and pressed a button. And a pulse of blue light hit Ven in the chest, and the mighty Cross student collapsed to the floor like his bones had turned to water. And he lay there twitching and moaning as his nervous system overloaded. 2 more Cross students charged after seeing their friend fall, and they met the same fate within seconds, and their armored bodies hit the floor one after another. And Maya understood that the Vex had come prepared for every species they might encounter. The Villani students tried next, and Maya felt a strange pressure in her head as they unleashed their telepathic attacks against the invaders. But the Vex soldiers did not even flinch, and Maya noticed small devices attached to their heads that must have been psionic shields blocking mental intrusion. "Your mind tricks do not work on us," the commander said with what might have been amusement. "We have studied every species in this academy, and we have prepared countermeasures for all of you." Professor Ketherick stepped forward with all four of his arms raised in a gesture of peace. And his translator clicked rapidly as he tried to negotiate. "Please," the professor said. "These are children from across the galaxy, and their governments will pay any ransom you demand, and there is no need for violence here." The commander's mandibles clicked twice, and then he struck Professor Ketherick across the face with one armored limb. And the professor flew backward and crashed into a desk and did not get up again. Sora was crying now and clinging to Maya's arm. And all around them students were screaming and begging and trying to hide behind furniture. And the Vex soldiers moved through the room with cold efficiency, grabbing students and forcing them to kneel in the center of the classroom. Maya did not scream, and she did not cry, and she did not try to hide. And instead she watched, and she watched with the focus of a predator, even though she felt like prey. She watched the way the Vex soldiers moved, and she noticed that they always stayed at least 2 meters apart from each other, probably to avoid being caught in a group attack. She watched the commander, and she noticed that his left mandible twitched slightly before he gave orders to his soldiers. A tiny tell that revealed his intentions a half-second before he acted. She watched the soldiers' patrol patterns, and she noticed that they avoided walking near the ventilation shafts in the ceiling, probably because their large bodies could not fit through the narrow passages. She watched the neural disruptors they carried, and she noticed that they had to wait 3 seconds between shots, probably because the weapons needed time to recharge. She watched the gap in their formation near the far wall where a maintenance hatch led to the station's utility corridors, and she watched the way the soldiers never quite covered that angle properly. Her mind raced through possibilities, not with superhuman speed, but with something else entirely, something that her teachers had never tested for and her classmates had never valued, something that came from being small and weak in a universe full of things that were bigger and stronger. Humans had never survived by being the fastest or the toughest, and Maya knew this, and she knew that her ancestors had killed mammoths with sticks and rocks and clever plans. And she knew that somewhere inside her was the same spark that had allowed her species to conquer a planet without claws or fangs or armor. The commander was moving toward Maya and Sora now, and his compound eyes fixed on them with cold interest. "A human," he said, and his mandibles clicked in what might have been curiosity. "We do not often see your kind out here among the stars, and you are so fragile and so short-lived. And I wonder what your mind will taste like when we harvest it." Maya let her body go limp, and she let tears fill her eyes, and she made herself look as small and helpless as possible. And this was not hard, because she was small, and she was helpless in almost every way that mattered. But she was also thinking, and she was planning, and she was calculating angles and distances and timing. "Please," Maya whispered to Sora, and her voice was so quiet that only her friend could hear. "I have a plan, but I need you to trust me, and I need about 4 minutes." Sora's large dark eyes looked at Maya with confusion and fear. But somewhere beneath the terror, there was also a tiny spark of hope. And she gave the smallest nod that Maya had ever seen. Maya looked at the commander, and she let her lower lip tremble, and she made her voice high and frightened like a much younger child. "Please, sir," Maya said. And she hated how weak she sounded, but she knew it was necessary. "I need to use the sanitation unit, and I cannot hold it any longer. And please, I am just a little human girl, and I am so scared." The commander's mandibles twitched with disgust, and Maya knew she had found the right button to push, because the Vex were known throughout the galaxy for their extreme aversion to biological contamination. And the thought of a human child having an accident in their presence was clearly revolting to him. "Take her." The commander ordered one of his soldiers. "Let her use the facilities in the corridor and bring her back quickly, and do not let her make a mess." The soldier grabbed Maya's arm roughly and dragged her toward the hole in the blast door. And Maya stumbled and trembled and played her part perfectly. and nobody in the room suspected that the frightened little human girl had already begun to fight back. The vexed soldier pushed Maya through the smoking hole in the blast door and into the corridor beyond, and the station hallway stretched out before her with emergency lights casting everything in shades of red and shadow. Maya kept her body hunched and scared-looking as the soldier guided her toward the sanitation unit at the end of the hall. But her eyes were moving constantly and taking in every detail of her surroundings. She noticed the power junction box on the wall about 10 meters ahead, and she remembered from her station orientation that these boxes controlled the local electrical systems for each section. She noticed a ventilation grate in the ceiling just past the power junction, and she estimated that the opening was about 40 centimeters wide, which was too small for a vexed soldier, but just right for a 12-year-old human girl. She noticed that her escort was holding his neural disruptor loosely in one hand, and she noticed that his other hand was gripping her arm with enough force to leave bruises. Maya had been carrying her engineering toolkit in her jacket pocket all day because she had a repair project due next week. And inside that toolkit was a small magnetic clamp that she used for holding components in place while she worked on them. The clamp was nothing special, just a basic tool that any student might carry. But Maya's mind was already seeing possibilities that no one else would think of. She pretended to stumble, and she let out a small cry of pain, and she grabbed the soldier's leg as if trying to steady herself. "I am sorry," Maya whimpered. "I am so clumsy, and I am so scared, and please do not hurt me." The soldier made a sound of irritation and pulled her back to her feet, and he did not notice that Maya's quick fingers had attached the magnetic clamp to a seam in his leg armor, right near a cluster of wires that probably connected to his neural disruptor's power supply. Maya stumbled again as they passed the power junction, and this time she fell against the wall, and her shoulder hit the junction box hard enough to flip open the access panel. "Stupid creature," the soldier growled through his translator. "Walk properly or I will drag you." "I am trying," Maya cried. And her tears were real now because her shoulder really did hurt. But beneath the pain, her mind was racing through calculations. The magnetic clamp she had planted was designed to hold metal components together by creating a strong electromagnetic field. And when that field came into contact with the power junction's output cables, it would create a feedback loop that would short out anything electrical within a 2-meter radius. Maya just needed to get away before it happened. They reached the sanitation unit and the soldier pushed her toward the door. And Maya went inside and closed the door behind her and finally allowed herself to breathe. She had maybe 60 seconds before the soldier became suspicious, and she needed to use every one of them. The sanitation unit was small, but it had a maintenance access panel in the ceiling, and Maya climbed onto the sink and pushed the panel aside. And above her was the darkness of the ventilation system that ran throughout the station. She pulled herself up into the shaft with strength that surprised her because she had never been athletic. But fear and adrenaline were doing things to her body that she did not fully understand. The shaft was cramped and dark, and it smelled like recycled air and old dust. But Maya did not care because she was free, and she was moving, and she had a plan behind her. She heard the soldier banging on the sanitation unit door, and then she heard a crackling sound followed by a loud pop. And she knew that the magnetic clamp had done its work. The soldier's neural disruptor would be useless now, and probably his communication device too. And Maya allowed herself a small smile in the darkness. She crawled through the ventilation shaft as quietly as she could, and she tried to remember the station layout that she had memorized during her first week here, back when she had been bored and lonely and had nothing better to do than study maps. Maya's grandmother had been a soldier once, back on Earth during a war that seemed very far away now, and she had told Maya stories about fighting against enemies who were bigger and stronger and better equipped. The tiger does not fear the mosquito, her grandmother had said, And that is exactly how the mosquito wins, because when you are small and weak, the best weapon you have is being underestimated. Maya had not understood those words when she was younger, but she understood them now as she crawled through the darkness toward the classroom where her friends were being held. She had no armor like the Kroth, and no telepathy like the Thalani, and no special senses like the Sindari. And she had nothing but her human brain and her human hands and 100,000 years of evolutionary pressure that had turned her ancestors from prey into the most dangerous predators on their planet. The Vex had prepared countermeasures for every species in the Academy, but they had not prepared for her, because what was there to prepare for when dealing with a weak little human girl? Maya found an access point that led to the station's environmental control room, and she dropped down from the ventilation shaft and landed softly on the floor. The room was empty because the station crew was either hiding or captured, and Maya walked quickly to the main control console and began typing commands that she probably should not have known. But Maya had spent many lonely nights exploring the station's computer systems because she had no friends to spend time with, and because the alien students did not want to talk to the fragile little human. And she had learned things that she was not supposed to know. She found the atmospheric controls for the corridor outside her classroom, and she adjusted the nitrogen levels upward by 15%, which was harmless to most species, but would cause disorientation and drowsiness in Vex soldiers within minutes. She found this communication frequencies that the Vex were using, and she set up a program to broadcast their own chatter back at them on a slight delay, which would create confusion about true positions and orders. She found the maintenance drone controls, and she reprogrammed a cleaning robot to recognize Vex biosignatures as debris that needed to be cleared away. Maya worked quickly and quietly, and her fingers moved across the console with a confidence that she did not feel inside. And all the while she was thinking about Sora and the other students who were counting on her even though they did not know it yet. When she was finished, she climbed back into the ventilation shaft and began making her way toward the classroom. And she carried with her the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy, not a gun or a bomb or a blade, but a human mind that refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. Her grandmother had been right about mosquitoes and tigers, and Maya was about to teach the Vex Collective a lesson that they would never forget. Maya moved through the ventilation shafts like a ghost, and the metal walls around her were cold against her hands and knees. But she barely noticed, because her mind was focused entirely on the task ahead. Below her through the grates, she could see Vex soldiers patrolling the corridors, and she could already see that her atmospheric adjustments were having an effect. The soldiers were moving slower than before, and their mandibles were clicking in confused patterns. And some of them were shaking their heads as if trying to clear away fog that had settled inside their minds. The nitrogen-heavy air was doing its work, and the Vex did not even realize what was happening to them because the change was so gradual and so subtle. Maya reached a junction in the ventilation system, and she paused to listen. And she could hear voices coming through her personal communicator, which she had tuned to the Vex command frequency. Squad 4 report to Section 7. A voice commanded, Squad 4 is already in Section 7. Another voice responded, negative. Squad 4 is in Section 3, according to my display. My display shows Squad 4 in Section 9. The confusion was spreading exactly as Maya had planned, and the delayed broadcast of their own communications was creating chaos in their coordination. Maya smiled in the darkness and continued crawling toward the classroom. She reached a storage bay along the way and dropped down from the ventilation shaft to gather supplies. And she moved through the shelves quickly and grabbed anything that might be useful. She found industrial adhesive and chemical compounds and emergency flares and a coil of thin wire. and she stuffed everything into her jacket pockets until she could barely move. Two Vex soldiers entered the storage bay before she could escape, and Maya's heart nearly stopped as she pressed herself against the back of a tall shelf and tried not to breathe. The human child escaped through the sanitation unit. One soldier said to the other, "The commander is furious." "It does not matter," the other soldier replied. "What can one small human do against us anyway? She is probably hiding somewhere and crying. Still, we should find her before the commander decides to punish us for the failure." The soldiers began searching the storage bay, and Maya knew she had only seconds before they found her hiding spot. She looked around desperately, and her eyes fell on the cargo containers stacked against the wall. And she noticed that they were held in place by magnetic clamps similar to the one she had used earlier. And she noticed that the containers were stacked in a way that made them unstable. Maya grabbed a coil of wire from her pocket and quickly tied one end to the release mechanism of the nearest magnetic clamp. And then she crawled along the floor, staying low behind the shelves. And she tied the other end of the wire to a container on the opposite side of the room. When the first soldier walked between the two anchor points, the wire pulled tight and released both magnetic clamps at once, and the cargo containers came crashing down in a cascade that filled the room with noise and confusion. Maya did not wait to see what happened, and she ran for the ventilation shaft and pulled herself up and disappeared into the darkness. Before either soldier could recover from the chaos, behind her she heard shouting and cursing. And then she heard the familiar hum of the maintenance drone that she had reprogrammed. And she heard the soldiers screaming as the cleaning robot decided that they were debris that needed to be removed. Maya kept crawling, and she did not look back. She reached the section of ventilation shaft that ran directly above the classroom. And through the grate below, she could see the remaining Vex soldiers and the students who were still being held hostage. Only the commander and two soldiers remained in the classroom now, and Maya realized that her distractions must have drawn the others away. And this was better than she had hoped. The commander was pacing back and forth with obvious agitation, and his scarred mandibles clicked rapidly as he tried to make sense of the reports coming through his communicator. "What do you mean you cannot find one human child?" he shouted into his device. "She is small and weak, and she cannot have gone far. Sir, there is something wrong with our communications. We keep receiving conflicting orders. Sir, the atmospheric readings are strange in this section of the station. Sir, Squad 3 has stopped responding entirely." Maya watched the commander's left mandible twitch 3 times in quick succession, and she knew from her earlier observation that this meant he was about to give an important order. "All units return to the classroom immediately," the commander announced. "We are leaving with what hostages we have, and we will deal with whatever is happening here later." This was not good, because if the Vex left with the students, then Maya would have failed completely, and she needed to act now before it was too late. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bottle of chemical solvent that she had taken from the storage bay, and she carefully dripped the liquid through the grate and watched it fall onto the armor of the soldier standing directly below her. The solvent was designed for cleaning machinery, but it was also mildly corrosive to organic materials. And Maya knew from her xenobiology class that Vex chitin armor was technically organic despite its hardness. The soldier did not notice the liquid seeping into the joints of his armor, and he did not feel the slow weakening of his protective shell. And he had no idea that he had just become the weak link in the Vex defenses. Maya looked across the room and caught Sora's eye through the grate, and her friend looked up at her with shock and hope and fear all mixed together in her large, dark eyes. Maya nodded once and then held up 4 fingers, and she trusted that Sora would understand what she meant. 4 more minutes, and then everything would change. Maya pulled back from the grate and began setting up the final pieces of her plan. And she worked quickly because she could hear more soldiers approaching through the corridors outside. She positioned the emergency flares at strategic points throughout the ventilation system, and she connected them with wire so that they would all ignite at the same moment. She reprogrammed her personal communicator to broadcast a specific frequency that she knew would interfere with the Vex translator devices. She checked and double-checked every detail because she knew that she would only get one chance at this. And if she failed, then everyone she cared about would suffer. Through the grate, she watched the remaining students huddled together in fear. And she watched Professor Ketherick slowly regaining consciousness on the floor. And she watched the Vex commander growing more agitated with every passing moment. Maya took a deep breath and reminded herself that she was not brave and she was not strong. And she was not special in any way that mattered to the galaxy, but she was human. And humans had been fighting against impossible odds since before they had learned to make fire. And if her ancestors could kill mammoths with pointed sticks, then she could handle a few overgrown insects. She positioned herself directly above the classroom's central holographic display, and she prepared to drop down into the middle of the enemy formation. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was pounding, and every instinct told her to run and hide and let someone else save the day. But there was no one else, and there was no more time. And Maya knew that the next few moments would determine whether she lived or died, and whether her friends would see their homes again. She closed her eyes and thought about her grandmother and the stories of soldiers who had faced impossible situations and found a way to win anyway. Then Maya opened her eyes and began counting down from 10. Maya reached 0 in her countdown, and then she pushed open the ventilation grate and dropped down into the classroom. And she landed directly on the central holographic display with a crash that made everyone in the room look up in shock. For one frozen moment, nobody moved. And the Vex commander stared at the small human girl standing in the middle of his operation. And the students stared at their classmate, who had somehow escaped and returned. And Maya stared back at all of them with determination burning in her eyes. Then, Maya activated the program she had uploaded to the holographic system. And the room exploded with light and sound. The emergency flare she had planted in the ventilation system ignited all at once. And brilliant white light poured through every grate and opening in the ceiling. And the Vex soldiers screamed as their compound eyes were overwhelmed by the sudden brightness. At the same moment, the holographic display beneath Maya's feet erupted with a cascade of colors and patterns designed to create maximum visual confusion. And the noise generators built into the system produced a shrieking tone that was calibrated to resonate painfully with Vex auditory organs. The commander stumbled backward, with his armored hands pressed against his head, and his 2 remaining soldiers spun in circles, trying to find a threat they could not see. Maya had exactly 3 seconds of chaos to work with, and she used every one of them. She looked at Sora, and she shouted one word that cut through the noise. Now, Sora understood, and she reached out with her telepathic abilities. And she did not try to attack the Vex minds, because she knew that would not work. And instead, she broadcasted a single simple image to every student in the room. The image was a picture of the soldier on the left, the one whose armor Maya had weakened with chemical solvent. And the image carried with it a simple instruction: attack him with everything you have when the light fades. The students received the message in an instant. And when the flares began to dim and the holographic display started to stabilize, they moved as one Ven. The Croth had recovered from the neural disruptor blast by now, and he led the charge with 3 other Croth students right behind him. And their armored fists slammed into the weakened soldier with the force of a meteor impact. The soldier's compromised armor cracked and shattered under the assault, and he went down beneath a pile of angry Aina students who had been waiting for their chance to fight back. The second soldier raised his neural disruptor to fire, but he discovered that it no longer worked because Maya's frequency broadcast had fried the delicate electronics inside. He barely had time to process this information before the Sindari students swarmed him with their electric touch, and their bodies produced enough voltage to overwhelm his nervous system, even through his armor, that left only the commander. And he faced Maya alone across the ruined classroom. "You," the commander growled, and his scarred mandibles clicked with rage. "You are just a child. You are just a weak little human. How have you done this to us?" Maya did not answer, and instead she started talking. And she talked about nothing in particular, because she was not trying to communicate. She was trying to buy time and distract. "You know what is interesting about humans?" Maya said as she slowly moved backward across the room. "We are actually pretty terrible at most things compared to other species." The commander stalked toward her with murder in his compound eyes. "We cannot see as well as the Sindari," Maya continued, and she took another step backward. "And we cannot think as fast as the Villani. And we definitely cannot fight as well as the Kroth." "Be silent," the commander hissed. And he lunged forward with his armored claws extended. Maya dodged to the left, and the commander's attack missed her by centimeters. And she kept talking because that was her weapon now. But the thing about humans is that we are really, really good at one specific thing. And that thing is being unpredictable. The commander swung again and again. Maya dodged. And she was moving toward a specific floor panel that she had identified earlier. A panel that was directly beneath the maintenance drone that was hovering near the ceiling. "We spent 100,000 years being hunted by things that were bigger and faster and stronger than us," Maya said. And her voice was steady, even though her heart was racing. "And we survived by being the one thing that our predators could never figure out." The commander cornered her against the wall, and his mandibles spread wide for a killing bite. And Maya looked up at him without flinching. "We survived by being the thing that fights back when it is supposed to run away, and the thing that runs away when it is supposed to fight, and the thing that does the one thing you would never ever expect." Maya looked up at the ceiling and she smiled. The maintenance drone dropped its payload directly onto the commander, and the fire suppression foam expanded on contact with his chitin armor. And within seconds, he was completely immobilized in a hardened cocoon of white material. He struggled and screamed, but the foam only hardened faster. And within moments, he was nothing but a statue of rage frozen in mid-attack. The classroom fell silent, except for the sound of students catching their breath. And then slowly they began to cheer. And the cheering grew louder and louder until it filled the entire room. Sora ran to Maya and hugged her tight. And the other students gathered around. And even the proud Kroth students looked at the small human girl with something like respect in their 3 eyes. Professor Kethrix limped over with 2 of his forearms, hanging at odd angles. And he looked at Maya with an expression that she could not quite read. "How?" the professor asked. Simply Maya shrugged. And she was surprised to find that she was not shaking anymore. And her voice came out calm and steady when she spoke. "Humans are not the strongest or the fastest. And we are not psychic, and we cannot see in the dark. And we do not live very long compared to most species." She looked around at her classmates. These beings from 100 different worlds, with 100 natural advantages that she would never have. But we spent 100,000 years being hunted by things bigger and meaner than us. And we learned to think sideways. And we learned to lie. And we learned to set traps. And we learned to be the thing that is dangerous, precisely because you do not see it coming. The station security forces finally broke through the sealed doors and flooded into the classroom. And medical teams rushed to help the wounded. And officers began securing the captured Vex soldiers, but the students kept looking at Maya. And there was something new in their eyes. Something that had not been there before. It was not fear exactly, and it was not admiration exactly. But it was something close to both. Maya smiled at Sora and squeezed her friend's hand. And she thought about her grandmother and the stories of soldiers who refused to give up even when everything was against them. That is the thing about humans, Maya said quietly. And her words were meant for everyone in the room and for Noah in particular. We are not scary because of what we are. We are scary because of what we do. Outside the classroom windows, the stars continued their ancient dance. And somewhere out there, other species looked at humanity and saw weakness and fragility and short lives that barely mattered in the grand scale of the universe. But the students of the Galactic Unity Academy had learned a different lesson today, and they would carry that lesson with them for the rest of their long lives. They had learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not the creature with the sharpest claws or the thickest armor or the most powerful mind. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is a small 12-year-old girl who refuses to accept that the situation is hopeless and who carries inside her the accumulated survival instincts of a species that clawed its way to the stars through sheer stubborn refusal to die. The Vex Collective had come to the station expecting easy prey, and instead they had learned why humanity had never been conquered, and why humanity would never be conquered, and why even the greatest empires in the galaxy learned to speak carefully when humans were in the room. And Maya-chan, who had once felt like nothing special among the stars, finally understood that being human was the most special thing she could ever be.